The International Camellia Society last year established a new set of awards for historic ornamental camellia trees. In the summer of 2023, Caerhays decided to apply for the award for 11 very ancient camellia trees growing on the front walls of the castle itself. These camellias we believe to be at least 100 years old and quite possibly 125 years old. And our contention, until somebody can prove us wrong, is that they may be the very earliest Camellia sasanquas surviving in the UK today of that sort of age. Camellia sasanquas are fairly tender, and although they can be grown quite widely in the country, they're trees or shrubs that will actually die in a very severe winter. How do we know that these plants are 125 years old? And the answer is twofold. Firstly, we have in our garden archive records of the purchase of these 11 camellia trees. The earliest were bought in 1897, and a further few were bought in 1904. But the real reason that we know about these camellias is because of the garden diary at Caerhays, which was established in 1897 by my great-grandfather, J.C. Williams, and he started to record the flowering, the very early flowering of these Camellia sasanquas. So we now look at the first of the Camellia sasanquas, and there are 5 that we're going to look at. We're now standing looking at the first of these 5 Camellia sasanquas. Storm Ashley blew through last night on the 21st of October, and it hasn't done a great deal of good to this camellia. A lot of the flowers were shattered and the petals are now on the ground. But this camellia started out into flower on the 20th of September. So it's already been out for a whole month. And as you can see, there are still plenty of buds to come. So it's quite likely it's going to be out for another month. The flowers are small and quite a delicate light pink, but they are also very slightly scented. On a slightly windy day like today, you won't find that you can smell very much, and they're a scent that you smell further away from the tree on a very still day rather than by sticking your nose into the flowers. And when you look closely, you will see that there are quite a number of wasps going for the nectar in these flowers, because there is very little else that's in flower in the garden. There's a nice big fat wasp moving up there onto that flower, and I can see several flitting around all over the tree, so Carl needs to be a bit careful with the camera to avoid any unfortunate incidents. It's not at all unusual to find wasps curled up in the centre of these flowers overnight in the last gasp attempts to stay alive before autumn kills them off. So let's come round and just look at this tree, which is nearly 125 years old. It has a very drooping habit. It's clearly appreciated growing up the side of the wall. And when you look closely, you can see that there's a bit of rot in the base of the trunk. And when you look even more closely, you can see that in 1963, in the very cold winter, the tree was cut back to the ground and has reshot again very vigorously since. And this is true of at least 2 of the 5 sasanquas that we're going to look at. So let's just go back and talk about flowering times. In the garden diary, my great-grandfather records this camellia in flower on the 29th of October in 1904 and the 29th of October in 1905. In 1901, it was in flower on the 11th of November, and in 1902, it was first in flower on the 15th of November. Even more astonishingly, in 1900, the Garden Diary records this camellia being in full flower on the 7th of December. So maybe we can see what mild winters have done to Camellia sasanquas. They're perhaps flowering a month earlier than we might have expected. But what a wonderful show this is in very early autumn when there's so little else to see. So let's just move on now to the second Camellia sasanqua, which grows right beside it. This, I say the second because it's the second one to come into flower. And this is a single white Camellia sasanqua. Not perhaps quite as floriferous as the pink one beside it, but with a very different leaf shape, a very much more compact habit, just a little hint of pink on the tips of the buds and on the tips of the petals when they first come out, and that blanches off and disappears. But a very attractive plant, possibly more scented than the pink one, perhaps a more attractive compact habit. And here we see an even more unusual feature of Camellia sasanqua. Last year's seed pods are only now becoming ripe. So those were flowers exactly 12 months ago, which got pollinated probably by the wasps, and which have formed these seed pods, which you could collect now, plant the seeds straight away, and they would grow. Most camellias take about 6 to 9 months from flowering to produce a seed head, but these peculiar Japanese Camellia sasanquas take a full year to do so. So here we're looking at the third of our 5 Camellia sasanquas. This is far and away the largest of the plants. It's about 16 feet in height, so probably nearly 3 times the size of the second one we looked at. And in width this way, it's about 14 feet. And from the front of the plant to the back wall is about 8 feet. So it's a fairly massive plant, and probably in 1963, in that extraordinarily cold winter, this wasn't cut to the ground, and that's why it's probably double the size. Again, Storm Ashley didn't do us any favours last night, but when you look at the flowers on this particular plant, you see that they're a much darker pink than the first one we looked at. The flowers are much the same size. Inevitably, we've got a resident wasp enjoying itself in that one. The flowers are really quite dark pink when they first come out, and they fade off a bit. There's a fly trying to take up the last of the nectar on what's a pretty filthy day today. So this is none of these 3 sasanquas, or in fact none of the 5, have actually got formal names. We must imagine that when they came probably to the UK, probably via the Yokohama nurseries, which were established in London, that they probably did have Japanese names, but those names have been lost, and we simply refer to them as Camellia sasanqua, pink or white, although the 5 forms are very, very different. We don't have the actual names for them. When you propagate them from cuttings, they're very slow to grow away, and it takes several years before you've got a plant that's big enough to consider planting out in the garden. But once they are established, they go away really quite quickly, and they flower at a very young age in a pot, so they're very good value in that respect. In a week's time, we're going to have a look at the 4th and 5th sasanqua, which are not showing any colour as yet. And then we'll talk a bit more about the International Camellia Society and the hope that we might get an award for these very ancient plants. So it's actually been a fortnight, not a week, since we started filming these Camellia sasanquas. And here now the fourth Camellia sasanqua, which is also a white one, is properly out. The flowers are quite small, they open out fully flat, and I can just get a nice little bit of scent from them, although there's a little bit of an east wind today and it's a very overcast and drab day. Again, the flowering span of this camellia is going to occupy several weeks, if not months. You can see there are plenty of flowers and buds still to come, but already there's a pretty good show. And this is a very different camellia from the other white one we looked at. The foliage is different, the size of the flower is different, the way in which the plant grows is different. But nonetheless, it's a very pleasant thing to see in early November, first few days of November, as we are now. And here is the fifth Camellia sasanqua, which is the last of the 5 to come out, and it's only just starting. But you can already see that this is a much bigger flower than we've seen on any of the others, and it's sort of a mid-pink. It's not quite as dark as number 3, but it's not quite as pale as number 1. But the flower is appreciably bigger. It opens out in a strange way, a very sasanqua-ish way, you might say. And if we just come a little further round this very dense bush, and if we just look back into the top of the plant, you'll see that its initial flowering is largely right at the top of the tree, and we're still a week or two away from this being absolutely covered. You see a little bit of yellowness or variegation in just the odd twig or two. That's fairly normal in sasanquas, and it's nothing really to worry about. It's just some vague genetic muddle which manifests itself from time to time, and in one of the other ancient camellias which we're going to see in a week or two, you will see much more pronounced variegation of this sort. But standing here in the first week of November, it really is a joy to see 5 very different sasanqua camellias that are over 100 years old. And the criteria for the International Camellia Society recognizing a collection as being of exceptional historic interest is that the plants must all be over 100 years old. So we've looked at the 5 120-year-old Camellia sasanquas, but there are now, just starting to come out, another 6 ancient camellias which are also at least 100, if not 120 years old. And behind me is Camellia vernalis dawn, or properly using the Japanese name, Camellia sasanqua ginru. And this is a very late November, early December flowering camellia. And beside it here, we've got a Magnolia stellata. And we know from the garden records that this Magnolia stellata was planted in 1897, and its first flowers were seen in around about Christmas time in 1901. Now, if this plant was planted in 1897, it's pretty obvious that these 2 Camellia vernalis dawn, the second one is over here and has been heavily trimmed over the years, but you can see how close they are to the Magnolia sasanqua. So, in all probability, these 2 plants were planted very shortly after the Magnolia stellata. The reason this plant isn't flowering very much as yet is that it's been trimmed very hard. But if we go back and look at the one that's now probably 15 feet tall, we can see that it has a bit of virus, a bit of yellowing in the leaves, and you see that a lot in Camellia sasanquas and indeed certain types of camellia. It's a virus that appears here and there over the plant. It does the plant no harm, as you can see here. It just looks a bit variegated and a bit unsightly. And when you're taking cuttings, you need to be careful not to take cuttings from the variegated bit. But look how floriferous that is at a great height, a month before Christmas. A quite staggering plant for its age, and something that really isn't appreciated in the UK enough. An absolutely wonderful camellia and a very ancient one. So this is the 8th of our 11 very ancient camellias, and this is actually Camellia japonica. Camellia japonica has a much larger leaf than Camellia sasanqua, but this is a very unusual Camellia japonica because it comes out into flower in November and early December, and it flowers away well into March. It has a very compact habit, and we know from the planting records that this was planted in 1902. And this is a camellia with some confusion as to its actual name. In the planting records, it's listed as Camellia japonica noblissima, but actually that isn't correct, and my great-grandfather in his garden diary realized that actually the true name of this is Camellia Sode-gashuki or Camellia gauntleti. The two are exactly the same thing. And they are, although Camellia noblissima is a little bit different, it's not that different. But this is Camellia gauntleti, a very, very old Japanese camellia that probably again was sold to my great-grandfather by the Japanese nursery, the Yokohama nursery, which was based in London. And this plant has thrived away here and given us an enormous amount of enjoyment right beside the front door for about 120 some odd years. It's perfectly hardy. One lot of flowers will get frosted or blown away, but when you look, you see there are multiple buds and the tips of every stem, and so there's loads more flowers to come and loads more buds just beginning to show. Very often these old camellias flower first right at the top of the bush and only subsequently lower down. Not a huge tree, growing in not terribly good soil conditions, but thriving and still as good as ever, 120 years on from when it was first planted here. So 3 more historic camellias that are over 100 years old to complete the sequence we started in September. We're now in late December, and for about a fortnight we've had this little camellia, this pale pink camellia, out in flower. And this elderly plant, which has been cut down quite a number of times over its lifetime, and the last time only a couple of years ago, this and its sister plant over here with rather darker pink flowers, but they're all at the moment up very high. These plants have an extraordinary history. 1917, George Forrest, the great plant explorer, he's 7,000 feet up Mount Petardii, as it was called then, in Yunnan, and he collects seed from this camellia, a completely new species, unknown in Western Europe, a species we now call saluenensis. It wasn't called that originally, but that's the botanically recognized name today. And Camellia saluenensis in itself, it was not perhaps the most significant camellia flower that had ever been seen, but it had potential for crossing. My great-grandfather decided to cross Camellia saluenensis with Camellia japonica in around about 1923. And the progeny today are called the Camellia times williamsii. So they're saluenensis crossed with japonica. The cross has been made thousands and thousands of times all around the world, but all the plants that are called Camellia times williamsii all originate actually from these two plants here. So they're truly historic plants. And why suddenly was Camellia williamsii significant? And the answer is that prior to the First World War, camellias were considered to be greenhouse plants. They were plants that rich people had in their conservatories. With the creation of Camellia williamsii, the camellia came out of the greenhouse and into everybody's garden. Camellia williamsii are tough as old boots. You can even grow them as hedging plants. The flowers drop down from the plant in the main and don't hang around looking brown and horrid on the tree. And the flowering period of time is months and months, about 3 months. And this all stems back to this December flowering Camellia saluenensis and the opportunity which the George Forest created for my great-grandfather to cross two camellia species and create something utterly new. So this is the last of the historic camellias. This is Camellia japonica Lady Clare, which was planted here in 1902, and it's still looking pretty good today. Its flowers are normally out by December, and this year is no exception. They're semi-double flowers with quite a lot of little petaloids, and this Camellia Lady Clare was one of the parents that my great-grandfather used to cross back with Camellia saluenensis. And this Camellia Lady Clare, when crossed with saluenensis, produced the first two double-flowered williamsii camellias, which were called Caerhays and George Blandford. So in the evolution of 120 years, we've seen two species of camellia produce thousands upon thousands of hybrids, and this was one of the very first.